You're listening to Mom and Doc Talk, where we talk all things healing pans and pandas with an emphasis on homeopathy.
Hi, I'm Jody the mom.
And I'm Dr. Bar the doc, and this is Mom and Doc Talk, where we talk all things healing pans and pandas with a special emphasis on homeopathy. And today we're talking all about COVID and pans. I know we're already 3 years into, or over 3 years since COVID first really became an issue. But we just still want to talk about it because it's still here, where people are still getting affected by it. And it is affecting the pans community, both in various different ways, but it's also triggering pans for a lot of people, and it's triggering an adult like pans situation for a lot of people as well. So we want to talk about it to just make sure we bring attention to it and talk about how homeopathy has impacted the response and the way that people are reacting to COVID as well. So Jody, I think the first thing to talk about is when COVID first started, I just want to acknowledge that for the PANS community, COVID almost felt like a little bit of a relief because the rest of the world suddenly had to experience what a PANS family regularly experiences. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I feel like I experienced it a little bit differently because we healed before COVID and we were ready to come out of it. And we were kind of still in the process of coming out of it and like coming back into the world. And then COVID happened. And it was like, oof, like we got kind of pushed back into the PANS world. That it's so isolating when our kids get sick. We have to stop doing stuff, or we have, family and friends that aren't really jiving with what's going on in our world. And so we just have to stay home because being away from the home is too difficult or too stressful or traumatic or whatever it might be.
Too many triggers for the kids. Like
all the triggers too. And so we're like in this bubble. And it's like the whole world all of a sudden where everyone was in their own little bubbles. So it was so similar. I would imagine that there was a little bit of relief for some PANS families that were in the middle of the hard stuff, because all of the things that they had been having to say no to and whatnot, not that there's anything easy about it, but it's like the whole world shifted into this like inner with your family in your little pod mode, just like the PANS community was already in.
Yeah. So our Facebook group already existed, and there was a lot of talk about that when the shutdowns first started happening, about how people finally would understand what PANS communities were going through. And there was a brief reprieve for people where they had some relationships start to repair because people were like, oh, I get it now. I get why you were needing to isolate. I get why you had to say no to so many things and why you were so hyper focused on what was going on with your kiddo and concerned about infections or whatever, and like why you panicked every time that a note went home about strep in the classroom or whatever. So I think that there was some relief that happened, and as somebody who I didn't have to deal with PANS other than as a provider when the pandemic started, but I had a baby literally 2 days before it was declared a pandemic. She went home from the hospital the day it was declared a pandemic. And I know that it also helped me because like I didn't miss out on all of the things that were happening that I would have missed out on as a brand new mom with a newborn at home, because nothing was happening. So I felt grateful, and that in many ways I related to the PANS families there too, because there was no longer that feeling of like missing out on things that you would love to do, but that your life just doesn't allow. It also, for a short period of time, gave a lot of families some big relief because they weren't having to be forced to go into places that were causing exposures and triggers. And so there was actually, like, it was almost easier for some PANS families. And we had some kids that did better for a while just because they weren't having to go to school and they weren't having to, on a regular basis where they had exposures to things that were triggers for them, deal with the stress of getting to school and the separation anxiety that can come with PANS and PANDAS. They weren't having to deal with getting the frequent exposures to things. So like they were just already like good and they were happy to be in their home and to be in the space. So for some families, they actually got a bit of a reprieve from PANDAS. And then unfortunately, when the world started to open back up again, they tended to have flares come back again a little bit more frequently. So was there anything else that you want to talk about before we start talking about specifically COVID, PANS, and homeopathy, like about the whole?
As a mom, I can't like not feel like I keep thinking about I'm sure that there were families that it was significantly harder for, um, being stuck at home and not, you know, that for me as a PANS mom, Avery going to school, even though it's really hard to get her there. And I was worried all day long. It was like a moment to breathe, and that all went away during the lockdown.
Yeah.
And so I know some families had, that was more of a struggle for them during that time.
Yeah.
So
It's good to acknowledge that, because for some people it was a relief, and for some people it made things significantly worse because the supports that you did have to lean on, you no longer could access in most cases. So as we said, PANS can be triggered by COVID, and we've seen a lot of kids who never had any signs of PANS and had gone through other infections, and then COVID seemed to be the tipping point and it triggered PANS in the kiddos. It seemed to happen more so once we got to the Omicron variant for some reason. I think there were more neurological impacts from the Omicron variant than previous variants that were more respiratory. And so that was a big, we expected it, and we were surprised to not be seeing as much triggering of PANS with COVID until it finally did. So homeopathy, as always, is effective in addressing that susceptibility, because again, not everybody who gets COVID gets PANS, and not everybody who has PANS responds to COVID in the same way. And so it's about that susceptibility. And I think that this is probably what the most important part, maybe Jody, for you to share your experience when COVID finally hit your family. You fought it for so long, and then you were so worried because of what you were seeing, and like the parents that you talked to through your daily work, and like through our group and our community, that you were worried about when COVID struck your house. What was your experience?
Well, my husband and I were sick as dogs. And I remember clearly being like I was pretty out of it, but I also remember, having appointments and being like, wow, like I could feel significant relief from my remedy. So homeopathy helped immediately with the infection that I had. But I think the thing that stood out the most was and my husband and I stayed sick for a really long time. Avery got it too. But she wasn't as bad as we were, even though she had Delta just like we had. She did better. She had a lingering cough that stayed for a while, but she did significantly better than we did. And even though she had been out of PANS for quite some time and symptom free for a while, I was sure that was it. I was like, oh my gosh, here we go. Like everything's going to fall apart. PANS is coming back. There's just no way around this. Is COVID, right? We're going downhill. And that's my own post-traumatic stress. But I mean, she did really, really well through it. And I was like, oh, like it was just wild how well her body handled it compared to how my husband and I's body, and both of us are, not as far along as she is in healing. But she did really well through it, and PANS didn't show up again. So that was really cool.
Yeah. So what we have seen as like some sort of trends in our practice is that the people who have been with homeopathy and using homeopathy for their chronic state longer tended to do better when they got COVID. And so they had just the COVID type symptoms, not flares of PANS. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, they tended to have just COVID symptoms, or have the blip, like COVID for some people is a blip and it's nothing. The second time I had COVID, I've had it twice now. The second time I had it, I only figured out that I had COVID because one meal tasted funny and I had coughed twice. And my husband had had it the week before. That's the only reason I even tested or was even like looking at anything. That's all I had. I didn't have a fever or anything like that. The first time I had it was a little bit worse, but even then I only had a fever for about 12 hours and a little bit of body aches. and coughed maybe 20 times the whole time I was positive. So my experience as somebody who regularly uses homeopathy and has for a very long time was substantially better than my husband's experience, who does not really use homeopathy and does not have like a great response to it. He was, both times he got sick a lot longer. And so that's just really speaking to the susceptibility. It's sort of like, I mean, I think COVID is a great example for people, since it's just this thing that was all of us have had experience with, that we know that not everybody experiences it the same way. And like, that is like the perfect example of what susceptibility really is. Like, you've got people who are asymptomatic carriers and they're walking around and they got COVID and they don't even know until they've got a reason to get tested. And you've got people who literally die from it. People who are so sick, they feel like they might be dying. People have more fatigue from it. Some people have more respiratory symptoms from it. Like, it can just present in so many different ways. Some people lose their taste and smell. Some people don't. The first time I had it, I didn't lose any taste or smell. Same thing with my husband. But the second time I had, just like for one day, and or not one day, one meal. And he lost it for, actually, I don't remember if he lost it the second time. So just that's the different ways, and gives us insight into what our specific susceptibility is. So homeopathy has been used by lots and lots and lots of different providers to help people when they get COVID. It is not, I will acknowledge right up front, it is not an FDA approved treatment, and people need to make their own choices with what they do for their own healthcare. I mean, COVID it's a virus. So in most people, you're going to do nothing and you're going to recover. It just depends on where you're at. And so you always need to consult with your healthcare provider. And we're not going to talk about any specifics or make any recommendations for any type of treatment. All we're talking about right now is the way that it interacts with PANDAS and the way that we see things tend to go for people when they're using homeopathy. So that's all. Yeah. But yeah, so like the people who had been using homeopathy for longer tended to fare better with little to no flares of PANDAS in most cases. In a couple of cases, it things got a little bit more complex, and the earlier into care that people were, the more likely it was to come on and create like a more complex picture where it just shifted the presentation and maybe made it a little bit dicey for care for a little bit until we figured it out, and then we can get moving in the right direction again. But it can create a little bit more of a complex state when when you're already flaring, already really inflamed, have a lot of misdirected immune response happening, and then you throw in a new trigger and the body says, wait a minute, what do I do with this? And it just goes cuckoo bananas. Yeah. I know you've talked to some people who've had some experience with that. I don't know if you have anything you want to share. Obviously, it's not your story, so.
Yeah, I think that the most significant thing to me was, the inquiry calls that we do where we're talking to moms that are wanting to work with the practice. There was just this point where, we were talking to PANDAS moms, and then all of a sudden we were talking to moms when it was COVID onset, just over and over again. I think that like you said, Omicron was really, really hard on children, and caused onset for so many, and hard on a lot of families that were in the middle of their healing journey as well. COVID seems to be one of those things where I almost feel like, for a while we have heard more about COVID being what sets a kiddo back as opposed to strep, when most of the time it was always, oh, my kid had strep again and it was awful and it was horrible and we got, it pushes backwards. But that's it. At some point that shifted to COVID too. Nothing that families aren't able to work their way out of, but for some reason COVID was just different. It was just did a number on the PANDAS community and kids in general, I feel like.
So if you are in the early stages where COVID might have been onset for you, there is hope. Homeopathy, we're finding that homeopathy has been effective for those folks who it didn't start until later. And I want to leave on a higher note, or a hopeful note, maybe not higher note, but a hopeful note, that because of what we're seeing happen in the community at large with long COVID and all of the various ways that COVID can affect people, I personally am very hopeful that it's going to help us understand PANDAS better and help for greater acceptance of PANDAS in the conventional medical community and at large, because right now one of the biggest hurdles that parents face is the the non-acceptance of this, what's occurring in the body, and of this is a legitimate condition. And so I'm hoping that seeing what happens with COVID for people is going to help with acceptance and understanding of PANS and PANDAS as well.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's it for us for today. We are going to be joining on the next couple of episodes to talk about impacts on the family. So ways that PANS really impacts relationships and the family dynamic. So we hope you'll join us then.
Bye, guys.
We hope you found this episode helpful, hopeful, and inspiring. We try to get a new episode out every week. You can make sure you don't miss any by following us on Spotify or subscribing to our channel on YouTube. If you want to connect with us more, join our Facebook group, Homeopathy for PANS and PANDAS, where we have exclusive weekly videos and answer your questions about, you guessed it, homeopathy for PANS and PANDAS throughout the week. If you are already a member, give us a shout out and let us know what you thought about this episode. If you aren't on Facebook and would like to reach us, you can email us at podcast@resiliencenaturopathic.com. Until next time, take care and remember, this won't be forever.